Hey guys, I'm Georgia. This purry little thing you might be able to hear on my lap is my co-host, Rhubarb, and welcome back. Or if you're new here, welcome. If you're not already and you like what I'm doing here, then please make sure you click on the subscribe button down below and leave a comment saying hi. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to sit with me here and learn about this case. I know I always say it, but the number one most important thing in the world of unsolved true crime is raising awareness. A case can never be solved if no one knows about it, if no one knows to be keeping an eye or ear out for potential vital information. All it takes is that one person with the smallest bit of information, and an entire case could be blown wide open. At the end of the day, that's what I hope to do here with my platform, to spread the word to people who might be unaware of these cases. And it's why I always say that if you live in the city, town or area that I'm focusing on in a video, it's really important that you continue to spread the word, whether that's by sharing the video on your Facebook page or just by talking to people, talking to older relatives who might have been around at this time, who might know something. This is a case that piqued my interest when I received a comment about it a couple of months ago on my channel, with a viewer giving me a sort of brief synopsis and asking me to look into it, and I immediately put it towards the top of my list. Unsolved serial killer cases are ones where the perpetrator has had multiple opportunities to mess up. They've committed multiple crimes on multiple different days. That makes it much more likely that someone has seen something or knows something. I kind of went into researching this case expecting a wealth of information available, but that simply wasn't the case here. There isn't loads about these crimes online, but we all know that's never going to deter me. The case of the Oklahoma City butcher refers to an unidentified serial killer who's thought to have murdered 3 women between 1976 and 1986 in Oklahoma City in, you guessed it, Oklahoma in the USA. All 3 victims were young, homeless Native American women who had possible connections to sex work. From multiple comments I've seen online, it does seem like even people living in Oklahoma City at the time of these murders were never really made aware of what was going on. I mean, there were definitely newspaper articles about this, particularly about the second murder I found, but it wasn't exactly front page news. It wasn't the lead story on any of the news channels. It was kind of just swept under the rug for the most part. There's an epidemic across North America called Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, and you might also see it abbreviated on the internet, just MMIW. This refers to the epidemic of disproportionate levels of violence against Indigenous women in Canada, the United States, and Latin America. In the United States, Native American women are more than twice as likely to experience violence than any other demographic, with 1 in 3 Indigenous women being sexually assaulted in her lifetime, with 67% of these assaults being perpetrated by non-Native perpetrators. Honestly, I do have plans to do a whole video around MMIW. I've been planning it for quite a while, but it is such a broad topic to speak upon that it's hard to know what angle to come at it from, what cases to focus on. But I do want to get that video up at some point this year, so hold me accountable to that. But anyway, I say all of that to point out the disproportionate levels of violence against Indigenous women, to which all 3 victims fell victim to in this case. Why did the perpetrator target solely Native American women? Was it planned that way? Was it just by chance? Because Native women also disproportionately find themselves disadvantaged. They're more likely to end up in poverty, they're more likely to end up on the streets and having to turn to sex work because of some very deeply rooted issues in US federal law. It does all run incredibly deep. If you're living in poverty, you're more likely to have to hitchhike, to put yourselves in dangerous situations for money. And then, if something bad does happen and a Native person does disappear, investigators are less likely to take it seriously. The unidentified killer first struck in early 1976. It was the 1st of April when 3 workers with the Standard Drilling Company were on a break from work in the Research Park neighbourhood, which is right in the centre of busy Oklahoma City. These men were bored, they were looking around for something to entertain them when they came across an abandoned house, and of course, they decided to go exploring. Although this house was boarded up, they found the back door to be unlocked, and so they slipped inside, and almost immediately they were hit with this awful scent that they thought was just a symptom of it being an old abandoned house. It was just must and dust. The house was full of junk. The previous tenant was clearly some kind of hoarder, which the men searched through with curiosity. They used a gardening hoe to poke and prod at the junk. By the back door was a large popcorn bucket that they knocked over with the hoe. And then a human skull rolled out. Apparently at first the men couldn't all agree about what this item was. One thought it was a dog skull, one didn't recognise it as a skull at all. But I think that's something in your brain that protects you. In the same way that most people who find whole bodies tend to think they're mannequins at first, these men thought that this couldn't be a skull, couldn't be a human skull. But it was soon undeniable they were looking at a human skull, albeit a human skull that had been so brutally attacked that it was unrecognisable. A grotesque smile had been cut into her face at the corner of her lips. Obviously, these men left to call the police immediately, and I can imagine with this being April 1st, April Fool's Day, the police might have needed some convincing that this wasn't a prank call. A human skull in a popcorn bucket in an abandoned house. I mean, that sounds like the plot of a horror movie. But once the police arrived at the scene, it was very clear that this wasn't a prank. The police tape was set up, a crime scene was established, and soon investigators found multiple other body parts hidden around the house, as if this perpetrator had wanted to set up some kind of sick treasure hunt. If it wasn't the skull the men had found, no doubt they would have come across something else sooner rather than later. Investigators also found arms, legs, and a torso hidden in the house, along with a single hand, but the other hand was missing. Seeing as this hand was nowhere in the house, and it very much seemed like the killer had wanted these body parts to be found eventually, it was suspected that this hand had been kept as some sort of sick trophy. But not only that, the woman's sexual organs had also been removed, nowhere to be found. The autopsy quickly proved that this wasn't an accidental dismemberment, if such a thing even exists. Some sources do say that in the early days the police suspected that she might have been torn apart by dogs, and then the dogs hid her parts in the abandoned house. I don't know how they came to that conclusion, but the autopsy did say that this was carefully done, it was humanly done, it was almost surgical in precision. Whoever did this seemed to know what they were doing, they seemed to have a basic level of understanding of the human anatomy. It was thought that this woman had been dead for about 4 weeks when she was found, placing her date of death around late February or early March 1976. At the time, it was speculated that she was between 25 and 35, 5 foot, 5'4" with brown hair, and they also assumed that she was a white woman. However, later blood testing revealed that she was Native American and was also probably younger, more like 18 to 22. I found this fascinating. I had no idea that you could actually tell somebody's age via a blood test, but a bit of research tells me that is very much a thing. Apparently, the National Institute of Health funded a research team that was able to reliably gauge a person's age by just analysing a few hundred proteins in a person's blood. You learn something new every day. Apparently, it might even be possible one day to identify people who are sort of biologically aging faster than others, becoming prone earlier to diseases that are usually considered to be old age diseases. But I digress, I just found that so fascinating. Testing on Jane Doe also found that it was highly likely that she had come from a lower economic background. In all honesty, I couldn't find any further details surrounding this. It's not necessarily something a blood test will tell you, so I don't know how they came to that conclusion, but that is what they deduced from her body. They assumed that she was homeless at the time of her death, and she was also involved in some kind of sex work, seeing as the area her body was found was known for that. And therefore, her death was kind of just brushed off, as sadly happens all too often. There were also no means to be able to identify their Jane Doe. Seeing as only one hand was found, they couldn't exactly rely on fingerprinting to identify her, as they only had half the picture. Obviously, they found no ID on her body, and her face was disfigured beyond recognition. Regardless, a facial reconstruction was created that same year by forensic sculptor Betty Pat Gatliff, which would eventually play a part in Jane Doe's identification, along with her only really distinguishable feature, the fact that she had very short, deformed fingers. They had no clue as to Jane Doe's identity until 1993, when a woman called Andrea Medina called in to the Oklahoma City Police, asking whether she was able to report her cousin as missing after 17 years. Andrea spoke to Sergeant Norma Adams, who took the information from her about her cousin, Kathy Lynn Shackelford, describing her as a young Native American woman with curly hair. Sergeant Adams then remembered a 17-year-old facial reconstruction of a Jane Doe cold case they had, who matched this description, the woman found alone in the abandoned house. When Adams looked back through the records and found out about Jane Doe's deformed fingers matching Andrea's description, she was sure she'd made the match. Of course, though, this did need to be officially confirmed. There was no dental information available on record for Kathy, so they placed an advert with the American Dental Association, hoping that her dentist would come forward. And they did, but they simply confirmed that Kathy's dental charts would have been destroyed in a fire at the clinic. So then there was a court order to try and get the dental records through a different avenue instead, through her medical records with the Sac and Fox tribal government. Kathy was a member of Sac and Fox Nation, so that's where her medical records would have been held. That route was also unsuccessful, so in the end it was DNA that came through. For 1993, this was pretty big technology, so one of Jane Doe's teeth was sent to the University of California, where her DNA was compared against blood DNA from Kathy's living sister, and it was a match. Finally, 17 years after the remains were found, Jane Doe was given an identity: Kathy Lynn Shackelford. Vera Grant, Kathy's older sister, said that the family had searched for Kathy for many, many years. Their mother had tried to make a missing persons report the very same year the remains were found in 1976, but it just wasn't taken. Their mother apparently had a very hard time coming to terms with her daughter's disappearance. She was kind of unable to understand why she decided to cut off contact. They'd assumed for all this time that she was alive because for years people had told them that they'd seen Kathy in different parts of the country. They thought she'd just cut them out. None of these sightings would have been correct. When Andrea called the Oklahoma City police that day in 1993, she didn't imagine that this would be the outcome. She thought they'd be finding Kathy alive. At the time of her death, Kathy would have been just 18 years old. She was reported as a runaway at age 17 in June 1975. A month later, she turned 18, and then 2 months before she died, she was treated at University Hospital in Oklahoma City. And then she was never heard from again. After Kathy's murder in 1976, the killer didn't strike again for a few years. And then on April 19th, 1979, some children were playing basketball in a park along the 300 block of Northeast 10th Street. Again, incredibly central to the city and very close to the abandoned house where Kathy had been found. One of the kids had a dog with them who went off exploring, as dogs tend to do, and then the dog returned with an oddly shaped object, taking it to an alleyway nearby. When the kids went to investigate, they found it was a human head. This was shortly before 8 p.m, and of course they raised the alarm with the local resident who called the police, and they arrived at the scene very quickly. It was fairly clear from the state of the head that this was a very recent murder. It hadn't been in its hiding spot for very long when the dog found it. So a huge operation was launched. Perhaps the killer was still nearby. Officers cordoned off the alley and the whole west side of the block, and they started searching through nearby bins for potential clues. As they suspected that other remains would be nearby, tracker dogs were brought in, whilst a police helicopter was also deployed to search from above, and officers on the ground questioned the children. Had they seen anything? Had anyone been acting strange or suspiciously nearby? No one had seen anything helpful. Back at the station, police also started scouring through recent missing persons reports to try and ID the victim. And as investigators suspected, the head, which was said to have been severed from the body in a downward stroke from behind the ear, was not the only body part found nearby. By the next day, they'd also found a severed hand and a bloody shoe near the 900 block. They also found blood in a street a few blocks away from where the head was found, but they weren't able to positively connect that with the head. Also, within a day, police had arrested a man as a possible material witness to the killings, but he wasn't connected with the crime itself. He was held for mental observation, but it seems he was let free very soon after this. Over the next few days, police also found a pelvis and other parts of flesh, all of which were absent of blood, the killer seemingly having washed them before placing them to be found, wrapped in bags and newspapers. And I say wait to be found because it was very clear the killer intended these body parts to be found and quickly, placing them around the city in busy public locations. Again, like in Kathy's case, the dismemberment of this body appeared to be methodical and careful, like the killer knew what they were doing. It also wasn't frantic, so they were in no rush. On the 25th of April, so 6 days after the head was found, police announced they'd been able to identify the victim as 22-year-old Native American woman Arlie Bell Killian, thanks to fingerprints obtained from her left hand. It was also confirmed via dental records and relatives. It seemed that Arlie had had quite a difficult life. At age 16, she'd been beaten and raped by her own father, who by this point was serving a 35-year prison sentence, and this just led to her life falling apart. She was homeless, spending much of her time just wandering the streets, and relatives said that she spent time at Central State Hospital because of problems that had formed due to a paint-sniffing habit. On several occasions, Arlie had been picked up by the police, they say because she was wandering the streets alone and they didn't want her to get hurt. It actually seems like a lot of members of Ali's family had mental health issues. Reading between the lines, it seems there was a lot of trauma, a lot of sort of hurt there. And her brother, 21-year-old Perry Lee Killian, had actually recently been a patient at Central State Hospital himself because he also had a paint sniffing addiction. Shortly before Ali's murder, he'd escaped hospital, and upon his discovery, he was booked into jail and questioned by police, as apparently he had a history of violent behaviour and then his sister ended up murdered. However, he was found to be largely incoherent and he was eventually let go. He didn't have anything to do with his sister's murder, it was all just a coincidence. As part of the investigation, police spoke with dozens of friends and family members of Ali, hoping that someone might be able to shed light on who might have wanted to do something like this. The police commander, Robert V. Wilder, said to a local newspaper, the Sepulpa Daily Herald, "We're working on her background and habits and trying to find associates." Ali had never been reported as missing by her family, and they were not aware that she had died until they were asked to identify her remains. Police continued finding body parts of Ali for the best part of 2 months after her head was found, with some wondering if the killer was sporadically placing body parts for the police to find as some sort of game. Did the killer get a thrill from this? Oklahoma City Police Cold Case Inspector Carl Eastridge said to the Oklahoman in 2008, "This guy took great pleasure in placing the body out to be found and taunting police and making sure that the portions that he wanted found were found. They were placed in areas where he knew they would be found for their shock value." But then the killer seemed to disappear for many years. It wasn't until 1986, a whole decade after Kathy Shackelford had been murdered, that the third and final body attributed to this killer was found. It was the 6th of March when the remains were found less than a mile from where Ali had been discovered 7 years earlier. 62-year-old Archie Albert was out with his dog in his backyard or garden when he made a discovery in the tall grass that separated his land and the alleyway behind his house on Northeast 1st Street. As you might guess, he found body parts, the upper part of a torso, a lower left leg, and additional small pieces according to sources. The remains had been washed, and although investigators did search the local area, they couldn't find any other remains. But then 6 days later, a skull would be found behind a garage at 507 North Lindsay, after a man was just digging through some junk. Investigators were able to establish pretty quickly that the skull and the other body parts belonged to the same person, and the medical examiner wasn't actually able to establish a cause of death. I didn't actually come across a cause of death for any of the victims here, and although they speculated at first that once again this body may have been torn apart by dogs, they soon discovered that it had been deliberately and crudely cut up. Almost immediately, investigators made the connection to Ali's murder all those years earlier. And I'm not entirely sure here, but Kathy's case, it seems, wouldn't be officially connected until after her eventual identification, but there was speculation in newspaper articles of the time, and it was too similar to be ignored, so I think they sort of did kind of make that connection. By the 22nd of March, police had identified the third set of remains as those of 23-year-old Marsha Tina Sanders. Some other sources refer to her as Tina Marsha Sanders, but her driver's licence does say Marsha Tina. Marsha was able to be identified pretty quickly thanks to some pretty distinctive tattoos she had, which had been listed in police notes about local homeless people, of which Marsha had been. Just like Ali and Kathy, she was another homeless Native American woman who police suspected had been involved in sex work, although it doesn't seem like they ever knew this for sure. After asking around the neighbourhood, police found that nobody had seen Marsha the day before her remains were found, so it was deduced that she must have been murdered around the 3rd or the 4th of March. Other than that though, there were few clues to investigate in Marsha's case, as with Kathy's and Ali's. As I previously mentioned, tenuous links were made between the 3 cases. All 3 victims were Native American, which they knew about Kathy before she was identified thanks to that blood testing. Once Kathy was identified, it was found that all 3 had grown up in poor families, all 3 were likely homeless at the time, and it was speculated that at least 2 of them had been involved in sex work. The area of Oklahoma City they were found in was known for sex work. The bodies were undeniably all found under very similar circumstances, having been mutilated and dismembered in the same fashion. And then there's the biggest thing, that all 3 victims were also missing their sex organs, having been removed by the killer, thought to be as some sort of trophy. This suggests that the motive behind the murders may have been sexual in nature, perhaps connected with the possible links to sex work. Was this maybe a man who was on a moral mission to rid the world of sex work, rid the world of sin, a la Gary Ridgway? Was it a misogynist, a man who simply hated women and wanted to hurt them, choosing easy targets on the street? Well, to this day, we just don't know. In 1986, the FBI were asked to create a psychological profile of this killer, and it was said that he was likely a recluse who had a history of mental illness and psychotic tendencies. But honestly, that's nothing any armchair detective probably couldn't deduce themselves. From 1984 onwards, authorities did have one suspect in this case after somebody confessed to it, and let's see if anyone can guess the next words are going to come out of my mouth. Of course, it was Henry Lee Lucas. Lucas was a convicted American serial killer who had 3 confirmed victims and 8 disputed victims, but over the course of many years, he confessed over 250 different murders from across the USA. Although he may well have had more than the 3 confirmed victims, it's widely considered that he was not responsible for even a fraction of the ones he confessed to. DNA evidence has confirmed that he definitely wasn't responsible for at least 20 of them. It's crazy, I know, but it does turn out that if authorities offer a prisoner state dinners, television, all area access to the prison and more in exchange for confessions, a prisoner is likely going to start confessing to random crimes just for the rewards. A lot of the time, authorities even let Lucas look at the case files to refresh his memory, and then he would suddenly remember committing them and confess. Henry Lee Lucas became somewhat of a scapegoat for the Texas authorities where he was held. If they couldn't close a case, they let Lucas do it for them. Problem solved. So in 1984, Lucas confesses to being responsible for the murder of Arlie Bell Killian. And investigators did spend a good amount of time investigating this possibility, as at this time in the mid-80s, his false confessions weren't quite as well known. Although there were records of him being in Oklahoma City during his travels, he was a drifter, they were never able to confirm or deny his involvement in Arlie's murder. But then Marcia was murdered, at which time Lucas was in prison and it couldn't possibly have been him, so he was no longer a suspect. Plus, Inspector Carl Eastridge said to the Daily Oklahoman that they've always worked under the assumption that whoever committed these murders, these crimes, was a local. They seem to have a very deep understanding of this local area, where the body parts would be found, but not always straight away, just eventually. The killer would have known how not to draw attention to himself in this area. He would have blended in. He was probably a local. In terms of suspects though, that's about all I have for you. Whilst doing my research for this episode, I actually did come across a really interesting video on YouTube by a woman called Becky Long, and the video is called "My Dad Was a Serial Killer Called the OKC Butcher, and I Believe He Killed Karina Saunders." I don't need to give you much of a synopsis there, it's all in the title. Karina Saunders was a 19-year-old woman who was brutally murdered and dismembered in October 2011. She was found in a duffel bag and a laundry bag behind a grocery store in Bethany, Oklahoma. Whilst most of Karina's body was found, her hands and feet were missing, and it seemed as if her killer had attempted to remove a tattoo on her back in order to stop her being identified. This obviously has been classed as a violent death, the manner of which is a homicide. Just over 11 years on now, Karina's case remains unsolved, and it does have an obvious link to the OKC Butcher victims in that she was dismembered. Becky Long is claiming in her YouTube video that her father is the one responsible for all of these murders. I debated sharing some of the details of Becky's video myself here, but I've decided that actually there's no better person to tell Becky's story than Becky herself. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to link her video down below and ask that you go and watch it for yourself. Just a warning though that the video does cover some pretty heavy topics, with Becky sharing the abuse she herself endured as a child at the hands of her father, so do only watch if you feel you can cope with that. Becky says that she just wants to paint a full picture of who her father is, and I must say that she does put forward some pretty compelling evidence against her father being the OKC Butcher. But I couldn't find any information anywhere online that he was being looked at by the authorities as a genuine suspect here. Perhaps he is, perhaps he isn't. Becky's video only went live towards the end of May last year, and he already died back in 2017. Again, I'd urge you to go and watch that video for more information. You can decide for yourself whether or not you believe the information Becky shares, but I just thought it was very interesting. And that's about all the information I have for you in terms of the Oklahoma City Butcher. Over the years, multiple people have been questioned in connection with this case, but they've all been ruled out as possible perpetrators. The murder investigations of all 3 women, so Kathy Lynn Shackelford, Arlie Bell Killian and Marcia Tina Sanders, remain open to this day. Investigators have asked that anyone with any information regarding their deaths contact the Oklahoma City Crime Stoppers either via phone or online. I'll leave the details for both down below, of course. I don't know if they have any viable DNA from these crime scenes. I hope they do, but I didn't see that specified anywhere. Hopefully by the final murder in 1986, enough was beginning to be known around the field of DNA evidence that the evidence would have been stored accordingly, but honestly, I don't know, I'm just being hopeful here. Like I said, there really isn't that much information publicly available about this case. We've just got to hope that the police do know a lot more than the public do here, and surely they do. They've got to, because we know nothing. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Thank you for spending this time and learning about this case, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.